So now we are going to take up another statement of Krishnaji and then try to explore it to whatever extent possible, and then try to understand whatever comes out of that exploration. I think it's going to be a very interesting inquiry. Now, what Krishnaji says is that the consciousness, our personal consciousness, which we consider as our exclusive private matter, completely separate, nothing to do with the consciousness of any other individual. So he says that that is not so. Our thinking that my consciousness is separate from everybody else's consciousness, that thinking is not right. He says your personal consciousness is part of the totality of consciousness, and therefore the contents, they get shared. That means contents of your so-called personal consciousness, they are part of the content of totality of consciousness. So in that way, the contents get shared. But actually, psychologically speaking, when we do observe ourselves and our thoughts, we always have this feeling that I am separate from the other person. I am psychologically different from the other person. And we seem to have some evidence to support this thought. Because whatever may be happening to another person at the present time may not be happening to me at the same time. So in that way, I'm not getting affected immediately by whatever is happening to the other person, or the other person is not getting affected by whatever is happening to me. So in that sense, the other person appears as different to me than what I am. But is it really so? Because many times the thinking activity or the thoughts, they generate the corresponding feeling, and that feeling is only the creation of thought. It may not be due to some facts or due to some factual situation. I mean, to give an example, we may be, say, physically completely secured, but psychologically we may still feel insecure. That means a person who is physically secured, right, but still psychologically he may feel himself insecure. So feeling psychologically insecure could be actually an illusion, but then that person is getting affected by that illusion, and therefore his behavior is as if he is insecure. But that insecurity is only at the thought level. Actually, physically he is not insecure at all. This feeling that I am psychologically separate than the other human being, or my consciousness is separate from the other human being, may be only a feeling which is created or generated by thought and may not be actually so. So then how do we understand this statement that my consciousness is part of totality of human consciousness? So in the morning we have seen that the consciousness is made up of its content, and this content of consciousness is put together by thought. So if we can understand the nature of thought, then probably it may help us to understand how our consciousness may be part of the totality of human consciousness. So experiment was done by the scientists, and there is one biologist, his name is Rupert Sheldrake. So Rupert Sheldrake, he had participated in one of the dialogues with Krishnaji. Those 4 dialogues, they are available under the title as Nature of Mind. So he had participated in that dialogue. So he had mentioned one experiment which was done by the scientist. So usually the scientists, they do their experiments on animals. So usually the animals are mostly the mice. They are very easy to handle and very easy to produce generations of mice. So they took a group of mice in America and tried to teach them certain skills. And then, so the first generation of mice, they learned those skills. Then they taught the same skills to the second generation of mice, and then the third generation. So what they found was that the further generations took less and less time to learn those skills. And finally, they arrived at a generation to whom they didn't have to teach that skill. They already had, they were those skills. So which means that the skills which those mice they learned, they got genetically encoded, and then the further generations didn't have to be taught those skills. They already had them by birth. Then after this experiment was over, then another group of scientists in England, they carried out the same experiment with the local mice of their country. That means those mice, they had no biological connection with the group of mice in America. So what they found was that in less number of generations, these mice could get those skills genetically. That means if in American experiment, if say 20 generations, after 20 generations, those mice, they got the skills without being taught. So here, the 10 or even less number of generations, the mice could get those skills without being taught. So after that experiment, they again did the same experiment with another group of mice in Australia. And there they found that those mice, they already had those skills. They didn't have to be taught at all. So without any biological connection, how could these skills get transmitted? So from that, they defined a principle saying that if a certain member of species learns a certain skill, then it is as if the whole species has learnt that skill. That means the other members of that species, they don't have to learn that skill again. One member has learnt, so it is as if the whole species has learnt it. So now how do we explain this? So he suggested that if we consider thought as a field, just as we have electromagnetic field, we have different kinds of fields. So if thought is also regarded as a field, then a lot of interesting properties can come out of that. So which means that each one, whenever he is thinking, he is generating a thought field around him. And whosoever comes in the zone of influence of that thought field is likely to get influenced by that thought field. And if two similarly thinking people, they come together and start thinking in a similar way, then they enhance each other's thought field, which means that we have a much stronger thought field. So if there is a group of persons who are thinking together, then they are generating a far more strong thought field. And then that can have its influence on whosoever comes in the influence zone of that field. So how do these fields get connected? Suppose we have our so-called individual consciousness, and that consciousness has its contents. Then whenever we happen to come under the influence of certain thought field, right? So that thought field, any content of our consciousness which has any resemblance or any similarity with the property of that field, it starts resonating with that field. And when it resonates, then the effect of that resonance is strengthening of both the things. That means the psychological content in our consciousness gets strengthened, and also that thought field also gets strengthened. And then in the world, so many people, they may have similar thought fields, and then those similar thought fields, they can enhance each other and create their own zone of influence, which then can be considered as the group consciousness. Krishnaji has talked about group consciousness. So he says that people having similar contents of consciousness, they form what is called as the group consciousness. So he talks about the group consciousness of a clerk, a consciousness of a housewife, a group consciousness of a lawyer, or group consciousness of many different kinds of people. So we find some similarity in the behavior of people. I mean, like say a group consciousness, an accountant. So you go anywhere in the world and then you observe the behavior and the way of functioning of an accountant. You will find striking similarity in the way they think, in the way they prevent you from spending your money, and in the way they advise you how you should spend your money, what you should do, what you should not do, and so on. So you find quite similarity in that. Similarly, the lawyers and the people from different professions, so share that consciousness. So it's a kind of group consciousness. So this raises an interesting possibility, which means that whenever you are thinking about something, are you really thinking, or you are just being influenced to think that way? Because many times we are so much identified with our thinking or with our thought, we feel that that is what I am thinking, it's my thought. But actually, it may be an induced thought. It may not be your thought. And sometimes you think in such different way than your normal way of thinking, that many times people even point out to you that, see, you are now thinking like that other person. So you are being influenced by that other person. That is why you are thinking like this. Otherwise, you usually don't think like this. So we are always getting affected by what is happening outside, getting affected by the thinking activity of other human beings, and also we are affecting the other human beings by our thinking activity. So if the content of our consciousness has a lot of fear, lot of sense of insecurity, lot of desires, and lot of other things, then we are actually sharing those things with the other human beings. So other human beings who also have a similar content, then we are enhancing or strengthening that content. And then that is our contribution to the totality of consciousness. So this is very important to understand, because our thinking activity is not an isolated activity. It is not our private affair, because whatever we think, whatever we feel, whatever we go through, that becomes our contribution to the totality of consciousness. And we are responsible for that. So if we are living a life of fear, if we are living a life of violence, if we are living a life of conflict, then that is what we are contributing to the totality of consciousness. And then everybody contributing like that, so you can imagine what could be the strength of this thought field, which is made up of this kind of content. And human beings are doing this for last million years. So billions of human beings for millions of years living a life full of this kind of psychological content. So you can imagine the strength of this psychological content as far as human consciousness is concerned. And therefore, it is not so easy to stand alone and face this and try to change oneself from this enormous burden of the content of consciousness. But it is possible. I mean, Krishnaji has showed it. So since we say that the one person through his thinking activity can affect other persons. So similarly, if one person changes, then he affects the rest of the humanity. That means one human being stepping out of this stream of consciousness, then he makes it in some way easier for other human beings to step out of that consciousness. So in that way, he helps the rest of the humanity. So as long as we have some content of consciousness, we are likely to get influenced by the outside or by the content of the rest of the consciousness of humanity. And maybe zones of influences of this different kind of consciousness. And whenever we come under the influence of that zone, then we start getting or we start thinking similarly in those circumstances. And then out of that similar thinking, we may end up in the corresponding action and the corresponding consequences. Now you can really feel if a person is sensitive enough. We don't need very great sensitivity to sense this. But you must have noticed that certain places where certain kind of activity is taking place for a long time, then that place has a thought field which corresponds to that activity. For example, the slaughterhouses, they have a different kind of atmosphere there. You can sense it when you go there. The atmosphere of fear, the atmosphere of anger, the atmosphere of helplessness, because that is what all the animals they feel when they are brought to the slaughterhouse. Or the atmosphere of a hospital, or atmosphere of a jail, or places where people are tortured. So they have a distinct atmosphere of their own, and any sensitive person can feel it. And also you can feel the atmosphere in different places. I mean, you can feel the atmosphere of when you are in contact with nature, right, where there isn't much human activity, then you can feel the difference in that atmosphere, the kind of joy, the kind of freedom you feel. All those things are the zones of influences of corresponding thought fields. So although thought is limited and thought is divisive, yet it is very important to find out what exactly you are thinking and why you are thinking. So the content of consciousness, because of our self-centeredness, we are only able to feel our so-called limited content, but we are not able to feel the pressure of the corresponding totality of consciousness. But the moment you are no self-centered, then you can actually feel the what kind of influence this totality of consciousness can exert. And one of the simplest example in day-to-day life, which is the influence of this uh, consciousness or the content of consciousness, is the fear of what people may say. This fear is very common in ourselves, because we are always afraid what people will think if we do this, or if we don't do this, or if we think this way, or if people come to know about these things, what they may think about me or about us. And that fear is very much there. So that is due to the social pressure, because we have a certain image about ourselves, and we like other people to have that kind of image about ourselves, because it is then very convenient. Because what people think about me, it matters to me, because I do want, or I do have expectations from other people. And so if that image is broken or damaged, then I may not get what I expect from the other people. And therefore, I have to protect my image. So I want other people to look at me according to that image, to think about me according to that image. And therefore, wherever there is expectation, there is also a fear of expectations not being met. And so that fear is reflected in this as to what people may think about me. And then we try to take every care to see to it that people think about us whatever we want them to think about us. So all this thing is very much there. So as long as there is a content of consciousness, we are likely to be influenced by the similar content which exists as a thought field. And then it will get further enhanced and further strengthened. So the real freedom is possible only when we don't have any psychological content. But then we can't simply wipe out the psychological content, because wiping it out amounts to disabling the psychological activity of the brain of the thinker. We don't want to incapacitate the brain. That is what will happen if we simply erase all the psychological memory. Then the brain will get incapacitated, because in the absence of memory, it won't be able to even think. So we don't want to incapacitate the brain. But is there a way where whatever the factual memory, the memory required to function in day-to-day life, so that factual memory should be there, but then the psychological memory is not there? So is such a situation possible? That means the brain records only the factual information and doesn't record the psychological information. Now, if the brain tries to do it deliberately, that means a thinker trying to deliberately do that, then it will end up in recording more psychological content. Because how is the thinker going to judge what should be recorded and what should not be recorded? And if he says that the psychological thing should not get recorded, then how is he going to decide which is the psychological content and which is the content? And its very desire not to record the psychological content itself becomes a psychological content. And therefore, the thinker or any thinking activity cannot do it, cannot distinguish between what is to be recorded and what is not to be recorded. So then how is it to come about? It cannot come about on its own without doing anything. So what is one supposed to do? So is there another faculty of human brain which is quite different from the thinking activity? Because one of the function of the brain is to record everything that happens in the form of knowledge and information, store it in the memory, and then respond from that memory as thought, and that thought leading to an action. That action creating another experience, and through that experience again gathering knowledge and storing it in the memory. So this repetitive cycle goes on, and we call it as our life or our living activity. So that is one of the functions of the brain. And as long as the factual information is getting recorded, there is no problem. But a lot of psychological content is also being recorded, particularly the events which are happening in our life, which are affecting us psychologically. Now, those events with that psychological feeling, with that psychological sensation, are also getting recorded. And somehow the brain is not able to stop that, because brain knows only the recording. So it will simply go on recording whatever it goes through. And therefore it will record all the psychological content also. Now, what we are asking is, this is how our brain has been functioning. This is how we have been living. And now we are asking whether it is possible to find a completely different way of living, which means a different capacity, a different potential of our brain, which is different from this recording activity, recording and then responding from that recorded thing. So it has to be completely different from that, nothing to do with that. So to investigate that, we have to ask whether there is inherent tendency in any living being to learn. Because we have seen that the living entity, as it starts living its life, right, has this sense of living or sense of being alive. And whatever enhances that sense of being alive, that living entity goes forward in the direction of that, which is enhancing its living experience. So which means that it has learned to move in the direction which will enhance its living activity or its living experience. So that means it already has a tendency to learn, which means that any living entity, by way of living its life, it is also constantly learning how to respond to a given situation. And then in that learning process, if there are certain specific things required, then those things, they get developed in that living entity. And that is how the law of evolution works. So we have this tendency to learn, the tendency to know. And probably that whole tendency is taken over by thought. So we are learning only in terms of knowledge, only in terms of information. And therefore, whenever we want to learn something, we immediately start gathering knowledge about that something. Because that is how we have been learning. And then try to understand that something in terms of that knowledge. And then act on the basis of that knowledge. So this is how we have been learning. But then, is there a learning which is not just accumulation of knowledge, which is not just gathering information and responding on the basis of that information? So, in order to find out whether there is a different kind of learning, right, the very tendency to learn, right, will make you observe, will make you look at things. Because without observation, you cannot learn anything. So even if you want to gather knowledge through the learning process, even in that case, you have to observe. The scientists doing experiments in the laboratory, they also have to observe, note down those observations. And then after processing those observations, they come to certain conclusion. And that conclusion becomes further knowledge out of their observations. So even there, the observation is necessary. Now here, we are asking whether such observation is possible where we don't gather any knowledge. So which means we look at something, we observe something, but without gathering anything through that observation. So usually whenever we try to look at something or whenever we look at something, there is immediately a response in terms of thought. And the very first response of thought is in the form of recognition. Recognition means assigning a label to whatever you have seen. And that label becomes the identification of that object. So if you are watching a tree, then the first activity of thought is to recognize it as a tree. And the moment it is recognized as a tree, the label gets assigned to that. And then whatever is connected or associated with that label, all that information also gets associated with that object called as tree. And that is how usually our thought functions. That is how we usually observe. But now we are asking whether it is possible to observe without the activity of thought, which means we don't even recognize what we are observing. We don't label it. If we are looking at a tree, we keep looking, but we don't name it as tree, because naming is the activity of the thought. So is it possible to observe without labeling the observed? Now this one has to actually do and find out. Find out whether we can observe anything without the activity of thought. Because that is where the clue for a different capacity of the brain. Because thinking activity is one of the capacity of our brain. But to observe something without the interference of thought, to observe things exactly as they are, that may be the another potential of human brain, which is never explored. Because even this tendency to learn, this capacity to learn has been also taken over by thought. And then thought is using it to learn in its own way, that is, learn in terms of knowledge and so on. But is it possible to learn without the interference of thought or without any reference to thinking activity? And what kind of learning that would be? And why is it necessary that we have to learn that? Because what we are saying is that as long as there is the content of consciousness, there is always a possibility of getting influenced and strengthening that content of consciousness and then contributing to the totality of consciousness the same content. And therefore, our life is always a life guided by various influences. So in that sense, there is absolutely no freedom. We have no freedom to live the way we actually can live. We have to live according to whatever these various influences they had. And in order to understand the nature of this content and the possibility whether that content can end by itself. Not that I want to erase it. But we have said that erasing is not the solution. But the content coming to its natural end. If we erase the content, then we are actually incapacitating ourselves. But if the content comes to its natural end, the brain is still there with its full capacity. We haven't incapacitated it. But there is no longer any content. And in such a situation, a completely different kind of understanding can take place, where the brain is fully alert, fully capable, and yet not limited by thought and knowledge. So only such a brain is capable of perceiving something which is not in the field of thought or in the field of knowledge. So that is why we are saying that the content of consciousness has to end naturally, has to come to its natural end. And it can come to its natural end only if it is able to live fully its life. Because this is another interesting point, that this content of consciousness is also a living content. It is not inanimate. It is very much living. And therefore, if it is living, then it has to come to an end, because everything living finally has to end, which we call as death. So death is a very natural phenomenon. So this content coming to its natural end is possible only if it has the freedom to live its full life cycle. Now the interference of thought doesn't let that content live its natural life. But the interference of thought, it not only dictates what or how that content should be, but it also gives it continuity through its activity. And therefore, the life is prolonged, the content is further strengthened. Now, this is also very interesting to note that we have said that for any living entity, the survival is the first concern. Every living entity tries to survive as much as possible. So this psychological content, it will also try to survive as much as possible. So anything which is endangering its life, it will resist, and it can do anything to enhance its life. Now this content, if it understands that the association of thought or the thinker enhances its life, then this content can actually make the thinker feel that that is what it wants, that is what it is doing. And this is our actual experience in our day-to-day life, because whenever thought comes to our mind, we feel that it is me that is thinking like this. It is my thought. And since it is my thought, it is me who is thinking, therefore it becomes my identity. It becomes myself. And therefore then I do everything to defend that thought, to defend that image. And actually, that psychological content which is making us think like that. But we are not aware of that. we feel that that is what we are thinking. That is my thinking. It is just similar to a situation where the virus is taking hold of the brain and making that brain think in a certain way. And in thinking in that way, the brain has a clue that it is being influenced to think in that way. It feels that that is what it is thinking, that is how it should think, or that is how the things are. So this content of consciousness, it is doing the same thing to us. And therefore, we give tremendous importance to our thoughts, our images, our opinions, our prejudices, whatever that we call as mine or me seems to be very, very important to me. And I do anything to protect it. So anybody contradicting my view, I immediately become uncomfortable. I end up in defending those. So I start arguing, or sometimes even the quarrels they ensue, and so on. So that is how we function. But if you are able to observe this activity of the content of consciousness, now that observation will become another activity of the content of consciousness if it is the thinker who is trying to observe. So if it is a thinker who is trying to observe, then that observation is no longer observation, but it is another activity of the thinker. And this thinker is nothing but the content of consciousness. It is made up of content of consciousness. And therefore, to observe becomes another activity of this content of consciousness. And through that activity, the content is going to get further strengthened. So, in the attempt to observe the content so that it can come to its natural end, the content is getting strengthened through that observation, because it is not observation at all. It is just the thinking activity of the thinker. So, observing without the interference of thought, if that can be done, then the content can complete its life cycle. That means content can unfold, live its life fully, and come to its natural end. So Krishnaji calls it as observing without the observer. Now, is it possible to observe without the observer? If a thinker is asked this question, then immediately the thinker will pick it up and try to find out how to observe without the observer. And then it may imagine and it may project and it may say that, yes, it is observing without the observer. And then nothing is going to change. So what is our response to this statement? Is it possible to observe without the observer? So whatever our response, is it possible to observe that response? So which means that initially we may ask this question, what is it to observe without the observer? So whatever that question triggers off, so that whole triggered process observing that whole process. And then while observing that whole process, whatever further may happen or is happening, or is it being observed? So that is the approach actually. The approach is to observe whatever that is happening. So initially it may be difficult to observe what is going on in one's mind, because whatever is going on in one's mind, there may be lots of vested interest. There may be always this feeling that you have to do something about whatever you are observing. And there will be also the choice and the judgments as to what it should be and what it should not be, and so on. It's a lot of load, a lot of knowledge through which we observe. So many times it is suggested that you observe the outside, where you don't have much prejudice, where you can't do anything about the observed. So there is no desire to do anything about it. Like you are watching a tree, or you are watching a cloud, watching a range of hills, distant hills. Now, while watching these things, you can't do anything about them. You can't change the mountains, you can't change the tree. All that you can do is just to observe. In observation, you may have your own comments as to that tree is not nice, or that range of mountain is very far away, or whatever it is, whatever your response to that observation, right? Then you can observe that response also. But then there is nothing which you can do about those things. And therefore, there is a less pressure of doing something about it. While you are watching the things within you, there is very much that pressure, because whatever you are watching within you, if you don't like it, then you will always try to do something about it. And therefore, then you won't be able to watch it as it is. You will make an effort to watch it as you want it to be. So looking at nature, observing it, maybe one can begin there and find out whether one can watch, one can observe without the interference of thought, without calling it a mountain, without calling it a tree, whether one can observe. And what is that observation? One can begin from there. And if one is able to observe without the interference of thought, then the same observation can be turned inwards, whatever that is happening. In fact, this is what has been indicated in Krishnaji's books called Commentaries on Living. So in Commentaries on Living, there are different chapters where Krishnaji has discussed different psychological problems with the people who had come to him to discuss those problems. Then he himself kept notes of all that, and from that handwritten manuscript, those books were edited. So you will find that each chapter begins with the description of nature, the description of what is actually happening. That means he is looking outside And whatever he is observing, he is merely describing it without passing any comments, without judging it, just observing as the things are. And as you read those descriptions, the descriptions are very vivid. Through those descriptions, your brain also starts visualizing, starts observing. And once the brain is in that state, then he slowly comes to the psychological content, psychological problem. Then he starts talking about it, and then he describes what the other person has questioned, and then what he said in response to that, and then the whole dialogue goes on. So what is important is to observe without the interference of thought, to observe without. It doesn't matter what you observe. So if you are able to observe even the external objects without the observer, without the interference of thought, then that is the kind of observation that is required. And if you are able to observe even one thing without observer, then the same observation can be turned towards anything else, and then anything can be observed in the same way. So it's a matter of actually doing it rather than just theoretically imagining and seeing whether it is possible or not possible. So when you are going through your daily chorus of work, or you are going through your daily activities, right? Are you observing yourself? Are you observing others without judging, without passing any comments? The way we talk, the way the other person is talking, his various idiosyncrasies, his movements, and along with that, your behavior also, your activity also. Which means you are observing everything. There is no choice. Whatever that is happening is being observed. So I think this has to be done in as one lives one's daily life. We don't need separate time for that. When we do get angry with someone, do we observe that anger? Do we observe ourselves as getting angry? And then do we observe what is our action out of that anger and how that is affecting the other person? So this opportunity to observe is always there. Things are always happening around us, within us. The only thing is that we are not observing it. If we want to do something about it, then we try to observe. But if we find that we can't do anything about the observed, then the usual response is that we are no longer interested in observing that. So you watch those hills, you watch those trees, you watch that beautiful landscape, right? So there is the initial impact. The brain is quietened. But then the thinker, it can't remain quiet for a long time. So it wants to do something about the observed. And when it finds that it can't do anything about the observed, because it can't do anything about the hills or about the trees and about the landscape, so it loses its interest in observing those things. And it may say that what's the point in just looking at those things? It is completely pointless. And then it is going in search of those things about which it can do something. And so that is how it happens. But observing without the observer, if you are able to do that, then that observation has its own quality. It is not a mechanical activity. It is not a thinking activity. But in that observation, you are connected with observed. In fact, there is no you separate from the observed. There is only the observed. So it is as if the life of the observed is being lived. And that is happening very much in your consciousness. And then that observed, having lived its life, then it also comes to its natural end. Particularly if the observed is one of the psychological contents of our consciousness, then that observed through this kind of observation comes to its natural end. So I think that is the approach to empty this content of consciousness. It's possible only through this kind of observation. So I think I have brought the theme up to point. Now we can take it further depending on the kind of questions you ask. So now your questions are most welcome, because these explorations, these meetings, it is our exploration together. So one person, he initiates the exploration, investigates, brings it to a certain point, and then others join. And then together we take it further. So that is actually the approach we follow in these meetings. So your questions are very important, whatever they may be. But when you are asking question, are you also observing yourself? That means, are you aware as to why are you asking that question, or what is the motive behind it, or what is it that you want to understand? Because many times the questioner is not even very clear as to what exactly he is asking or what exactly he wants to ask. He is a little bit vague. But then, if you are watchful, then you will also try to find out what exactly you want to ask. And if you are able to ask exactly what you want to ask, then that will enhance the accuracy of your observation. Because observation has to be actual, it has to be accurate, it has to be precise. Because then the correct learning is possible. If there are errors in the observation, then there will be errors in understanding also. So this questioning is very important and should not be taken very lightly.
Kishorji, I have a direct question.
Yeah, please ask.
So, if say the objective is to end the content of the, or sorry, empty the content of consciousness, stroke from what I could sort of understand uh, is to end the observed. Is it for the specific perception of how me as an individual would view it, or would it come to an end for the whole group. So what's the objective there?
I mean, there is no objective as such. What we are saying is that as long as there is the content of consciousness, I am subject to the influences, and my whole life then will be guided by those influences. Now, if I am really looking for freedom or a different kind of understanding, then this question, it's not a question of how I can end the content of consciousness, but the question is rather, can the content of consciousness come to its natural end? It's not that I'm trying to end the content of consciousness, because I cannot end the content of consciousness, because in the very attempt to end it, I am creating more content.
Correct.
So that is not possible. So the right way of putting the question is whether the content can come to its natural end. So when we put that kind of question, then we have to ask, what is it that is preventing that content to come to its natural end? Which means that the content is further encouraged to survive. The content is getting continuity, right? And why is it happening like that? So when one investigates that, one finds that it is the thinker, the observer, who is giving continuity to that content through its own activity. And therefore, the question arises, is it possible to observe without the observer or without the interference of thought? Right? So by questioning this, we are not saying that we have to observe without the interference of thought. Because when we say we have to observe or I have to observe, then that I cannot observe, because that I itself is the thought. And therefore, the thought, whether it can observe without the interference of thought, is a self-defeating question. It just can't happen. So the question is raised, if the thinker is responding to that question, then the purpose of question is defeated. Then which means that the thinker is asking that question. And that question is not a natural outcome of the inquiry. Right? So the question will naturally arise if one is actually seeing that the interference of the observer is giving continuity to the content, right? Because usually this may be just a logical conclusion that the content is getting continuity because of the activity of the thinker. Now, this statement, if it is understood only intellectually or logically, then it is only a conclusion. It is not the actual realization of the situation. Right? So the actual realization, the actual understanding of that statement means that the interference of the observer stops. Not that we are stopping it, but the realization that interference is giving continuity, that realization itself stops or makes that interference stop. And then the observation of the content without the observer becomes possible. So it is not a question of ending something. We are not trying to end anything. We are just asking right questions so that things happen in a right way.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
How is this observation to be dovetailed into daily activities of living?
So how this observation is to be applied to daily activity? To some extent, we have said that, but we can go into more details. That means, are we observant of all that we are doing in our daily activity? Right. If we are not observant, then which means that we are missing quite a lot. That means we are missing the opportunity to observe. As we live our daily life, there is ample opportunity to observe whatever that is happening. So if you are meeting a person, then there is an opportunity to observe that person, how he talks, how he conveys, how he behaves, what are his views, and at the same time, what is happening to you talking to that person, right? Your responses, the kind of thoughts that are arising in you, right? So not only that, whenever you are doing some work, are you observing how you are working and whether you are attentive to the work or you are thinking of something else? And if you are thinking of something else, what is it that you are thinking? And why are you thinking of those things? So this questioning, the questioning is not in order to find the answer. The questioning is to just make you alert towards those issues. The questioning is just to bring those issues to your notice so that you start observing, you start looking at them, you start watching them. And that's all. If you are asking question in order to find an answer, then you are not observing. Then you are searching for an answer. And you want that answer according to your desire, according to your wishes. So which means that you are not concerned with facts. You are only concerned with what you should get out of that question, what kind of answer you should get. And then you are looking for only that. So which means that it is not observation at all. And therefore you are not likely to understand anything out of that kind of activity. So when we say question it, the questioning is just to bring that issue to your notice so that you start looking at it, you start observing it. And as long as you are observing, that's it. You don't need to do anything further. So even when we are walking, so have we observed how we walk, right? And when we are walking in the street, are we just engrossed in our own thoughts, or are we also observing what is happening around us, and so on? So all these things, they matter. And usually most of the time we are lost in our own thoughts, in our own thinking activity, and we are hardly observing anything. And whatever we happen to do, we have just taken it for granted. And therefore we don't observe that also. Many times we are not aware of what is happening to us. We may be talking to another person, and while talking, we may be getting excited about what we hear from that person. And then we are not aware of that excitement at all. And out of that excitement, we may respond to that person. And even in responding to that person, we are still not aware of our excitement. So there is an interesting anecdote mentioned by Krishnaji in one of his talks, where he said that he was traveling in a car. So he was sitting next to the driver, and there were three other persons sitting on the back seat. And they were discussing about awareness. And this car, going with high speed, it hit or it overran a goat. poor got killed. And the 3% behind, they were not even aware of what has happened. And they were discussing about awareness. So this is the kind of anecdote Krishnaji has mentioned in one of his talks. So which means that usually or many times we are not even aware of what is happening to us. We are not even aware what is happening in our immediate vicinity. We are just lost in our own thinking activity. So that is not the observation. So as we live our daily life, we have ample opportunity to observe ourselves. And whether we take that opportunity and whether we observe ourselves or not, right? Or we want to observe ourselves only when we are interested. And then other times we don't want to observe at all. Even when we look at ourselves, do we start justifying what we see, or we really question it factually? So all these things, they are there. And I think one has to begin that at that level. Because it's a practical thing. It's not a theoretical understanding. It is not a philosophy and then you trying to live according to that philosophy. It is actually doing it, and in doing it, actually, you learn, you understand. And then that understanding brings the change in you. Because whatever you understand in real terms, that is going to affect your daily life. And therefore, that is how one has to observe. That is where one has to begin this observation, which is our daily life.
Good evening, Kishorji. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please, please.
So just to expand on, you just talked about learning
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
The immediate experience of when you observe something, that observed seems to come to an end, in the sense of you don't, when we talk about observation without recognition, you don't, there is no sense of what that is that you're observing.
Yes.
In that sense, there is so what kind of, so what is this learning that comes about through this observation? Is it a conscious
Yeah.
learning or an unconscious learning? I mean, what is the nature of that?
Yeah, see, it is not learning in terms of knowledge, but it is the learning in terms of happening. So what I'm trying to say is that, say a reaction arises. Now that reaction is a kind of sensation, a kind of feeling, a kind of emotion. Now, what is the need to label it? Why does one want to label that reaction as anger or as jealousy or this or that, right? If you don't label it and just stay with whatever that sensation, whatever that feeling, if one just stays with it, then what happens? So if there is no naming, which means there is no recognition, but the sensation has arisen, and you are not neglecting or ignoring that sensation, you are very much with it. But you are not naming it, you are not recognizing it, you are just being with it. Right? So, which means that there is no interference, the thinker. And if you are just remaining with that sensation, feeling, you will find that it is no longer there. It is gone. And still, your attention, right? Because you were with that sensation, with that feeling, which means that you were attentive to it. So that sense of attention, it remains, but the sensation is gone, it is finished. Now the same attentiveness or attention can go towards other things that may arise, the other reactions, other responses, other things that are happening. So it is just the attention being turned towards whatever attracts it, and no interference of thought. That means whatever that is being paid attention to, it is no longer there because of attention. So that is what actually happens. But then if attention, if that observation is the activity of the thinker, this will not happen. It will respect it as this or that. It will label it. And then it may say that, no, I should not label, or I should not recognize, or I should not do this. So it will get further involved into its thinking activity. Because first of all, it will respond whatever way it is used to respond. And then after responding that way, it will say, no, I should not respond in this way. I should not do this, or I should not do that. So further restrictions. And so that whole thing will lead one to somewhere else. So that is not the observation. So if you are observing an external object without labeling, without naming, right, then there is a sense of contact. There is a sense of being related with that object. Then that object is not separate from you. In fact, there is only that object. And it is said that if it is a living object, then the life of the object is your life also. That means there is such a close contact that you are living the life of that object. So you are living the life of that tree, or you are living the life of that bird sitting on the tree, and which is a totally different kind of relationship, which is not based on thought and the activity of the thinker, but which is through the direct contact with those living entities.
Sir,
So,
I
yeah,
have the question that
yeah,
whenever we talk about the naming the activity,
yeah.
the naming, do we mean a casual naming or the naming with psychological content? Because if I see a tree, I definitely know that this is a mango tree.
Yeah. No, you cannot make
So
much distinction like that, whether it is factual naming or psychological naming, because both are so much
no,
connected.
psychological naming comes when the tree, yeah, I have planted this tree, this is a mango tree, and this and that, and this whole content goes with psychological naming.
Yes.
Just passing by, if I see
Yes.
some tree and I recognize that
Yeah.
tree's name, and again,
Yes.
so the naming word, it is creating some confusion.
Yeah.
So naming with a past deep association or a casual naming, as we know in technological field.
Yeah.
So if I see a computer, I just call it computer.
Yeah.
So is it a problem, or the calling that my computer, my lovely computer, the psychological content involved in naming or a naming?
No, actually what happens is that the moment the label is assigned, that label has associated idea experiences. And
If
they
they
get
are not,
not
yeah, because
equal to 4, that is fine. I mean, there is with that. But then there are to equal to 4 because maybe in the childhood I was asked question and I was not able to reply because I had just started learning mathematics and the teacher punished me and so on. So it's a lot of associated psychological content. And so 2 plus 2 equal to 4, it doesn't remain just a actual label, but it has lots of psychological association. So all that can be called. Right? But as long as it is only a factual information, no psychological association, right? Then that doesn't matter.
that's the question, rather.
Yeah.
Because
Then that is
we
only
frequently read that labeling,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
it may be just a casual label, yeah.
Yeah.
If I see you, yeah, Kishorji.
Yeah. What I meant to say is that whenever it is necessary to label, necessary to recognize.
So shall we
That is,
think before?
yeah.
Shall we think before seeing that
Yeah.
whether it is necessary to label or no, or the
Yeah, I mean,
psychological
for
content is
example,
important?
yeah. For example, say if there is a sensation of some reaction arising in me, is it necessary to label it?
No, is labeling important, or if with a label I feel angry, and still
Yeah.
if
So
by chance
see,
I am observing it,
the thinker wants to label that reaction because it wants to do something about it, and it can only do something about it only when it recognizes it. So labeling is a kind of recognition of that sensation. And once it is able to recognize it, then it can do something about it.
I agree.
Hidden motive behind that, right? But say you are walking on the road and you see a car and you say, yes, that's a car. Well, that's fine. I mean, no problem. But then with that car, associated psychological content gets awakened.
Yeah, if it
Which
triggers.
means that, yeah. Usually that is what happens. Our labeling doesn't remain purely factual, but it does lead to the awakening of a lot of associated psychological content.
So can we say the labeling per se is not that important, and the labeling with psychological content is that is where
that means whenever labeling is happening, are we aware of that activity of labeling?
Yeah.
Because if we are aware of the activity of labeling, then we are also aware the motive behind that labeling.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And if the motive is the thinker wanting to do something about that, then naturally it is the activity of the thinker, then the labeling of psychological content. But if thinker just labels it and leaves it at that, nothing psychological getting triggered, then it's okay. I mean, nothing wrong with that. Because after all, we have a knowledge database, and that knowledge responds to the input. So that is fine. But then even factually also, is it necessary that suppose if a car is by you, don't label it. So how does it happen? I mean, is it going to make any difference to you if you don't label the car as the car.
No, so
Unless,
no. The
unless
question
you have to
arises.
respond to
Then
it.
the labeling is most important thing, or labeling is important and psychological content is most important. So there is difference.
Actually, the labeling is most important for the thinker, because through labeling it is able to recognize, and then it is able to also take a decision whether it wants to do something about it or doesn't want to do something about it. And if it wants to do something about it, what is it that it wants to do? So all that is important for the thinker. But if we take the observed itself, right, and that observed is being observed, and there is no interference of the observer, then observed is what it is. And since the thinker has no vested interest in observing that thing, right, so therefore there is no response from the thinker also. So usually the thinker is interested in observing only those things about which it can do something about. That means if it feels that it can't do anything about, then probably it is no longer interested in observing that. So that is usually the situation. For the observed as it is what is required, because only in that kind of observation the real nature of the observed can unfold. But once a label is attached, then immediately along with the label, the corresponding condition gets imposed on the observed. And then the observed is visible according to that condition, and not according to what it is. So it's quite a subtle thing to notice this effect.
So one question.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned that when we pay attention, when there is an observation of a sensation,
Yeah.
without labeling, which means
Yeah.
coming into contact with the sensation,
Yeah.
sort of ends it.
Yeah.
And one is left with the quality of attention.
Yeah.
Now, the problem that many of us have, and also I have, is somehow the quality of attention doesn't seem to continue. Because living in attention almost means living in emptiness.
Yeah.
So, so my observation or attention really doesn't go to any depth. It is always at a very superficial level. Whichever sensation is giving me trouble, I look at it, end it, and otherwise life goes on very normally. So you are talking about a life, living a life in attention, life
No,
of attention.
when you say that, when you pay attention, then that sensation comes to an end. But after that, nothing further happens in the sense that the life goes on as usual, right? So
That's good.
now what is going on as usual? Now, whatever that is going on as usual, can that not be paid attention to?
It can be, sir, but somehow the interest doesn't seem to go there.
Exactly. So, which means that the attender or the thinker is trying to pay attention only to those things which it is interested in observing, and not willing to pay attention or not able to pay attention to things which it is not interested in. So, which means that the choice is already made by the observer what it wants to observe. And so, once the choice is made, then the observation is a limited observation, no longer an observation, but the activity of the observer. So then it is not a different kind of observation. It is the same observation which is gathering knowledge and wanting to do something about the observed. So actually, whatever that may be, the attention has to move to that. So actually, attention is not an activity, because activity can be only of the thinker. And if thinker is trying to pay attention, then that attention becomes one of the activities of the thinker. But not an activity. Attention is a state of mind. So if it is a state of mind, then that state of mind is the quality of your observation. That means a mind which is in attentive state will observe anything that comes before it with that quality of attention. So there is no choice, or there is no such thing as how long I have to be attentive, because it is the thinker who is bothered about how long I have to be attentive. Because thinker is such that it cannot remain attentive for a long time. The thinker's nature is flippant, in the sense that keeps on shifting its attention according to its interest. So it may observe something and then it may get bored with that, get fed up. Then it may want to observe something else. And like that, it keeps on shifting from one to another. So a sustained attention towards one thing, then the thinker starts feeling uncomfortable, because it means that it can't be active as per its usual nature. It is something which goes quite against its nature. And therefore it asks, how long should I continue this attention? And it wants to come out of that attention, and it does come out. But then after coming out of that attention, when it starts hearing the benefits of sustained attention, then again it wants to. So it's quite a contradictory, you can say, the activity of the thinker, that when it is attentive, it is asking when it can end that attentiveness so that it can be its normal being. And when it is its normal being, it is again asking how it can sustain that attention. So it is quite a contradictory demand, contradictory behavior of the thinker. So actually attention, Krishnaji defines as the right kind of tension, because it's very important that attention is not a loose behavior, it's not a slack kind of observation, right? Because a slack observation will not reveal anything. So there has to be a right kind of tension, like the tuned strings of an instrument. If the strings are loose, they are of no use. They can't produce music. But if there is a right kind of tension, only then they are capable of producing music. So attention is a state, which means a state of right kind of tension. And in that, then the observed can show its nature, can play its music, and then through that we can see it exactly as it is. So if the thinker is getting fed up, if the thinker is getting tired, then one has to observe that also, and leave it, leave the whole business of paying attention for the time being, and then come back to it as soon as possible once the thinker has quietened down or the physical effects are, you can say, quietened. Because when it becomes the activity of the thinker, it is quite a conflicting kind of state of mind. And that does generate fatigue in the brain. The brain is simply tired and doesn't want to do anything. So if you notice any such thing, then it is better to immediately stop that whole activity of paying attention and then just be what you are till the brain comes to normal state, and then come back to the attention.
So one last question, sir. It also
Yeah.
seemed that we said that we start by observing nature,
Yeah.
which is outside, which is very gross.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then we talked about observing the sensations.
Yes.
And then we said as one observes the sensations, there is a quality of attention that comes about.
Yeah.
And then we said it's difficult to sustain the attention because of all kinds of interferences. And you explained that, which basically means some choice is coming in, because of
Yeah.
which attention is not able to sustain. So it's almost like choice is now a more subtler content than sensation. The psychological content of choice.
Yeah.
So it's almost, are you suggesting there is almost gradation of psychological content from gross to subtle? And the more subtle the content, the more difficult, so to say, to pay attention or be with that content.
Yeah. Because the thinker, the nature of the thinker is so subtle, our attention always escapes our grasp. And so by the time we are saying that, well, at least the thinker is not there, then it says from behind you that, no, I am still there. So the thinker is a very slippery kind of entity, very difficult to grasp, very difficult to, and also it is very subtle. So if you are observing something which is identified with the thinker, then as you are observing, the thinker separates itself from that observed and then shows itself as something else. And so it creates a feeling in you that, well, you have missed the observer. And so again, you have to start all over again to watch that observer. And so it keeps on eluding you like that. Right? But that happens only when you want to observe a particular thing. That means there is a motive behind your observation. But if you are simply observing whatever is before you, right, then there is no motive. So thinker may be there, thinker may not be there. It doesn't matter. But even if it is there, it is being observed. And if it is not there, then there is no question of observing it. So in any case, the activity of the thinker doesn't make any difference to the observation, because observation is concerned only with observing and not what happens to the observed or what happens to the thinker. And so as long as that kind of that is good enough, there is nothing more to be done, nothing more to be worried about. And if that observation is sustained, which means that the contact with the observed is maintained. And as long as the contact is maintained, then the observed gets revealed through that observation. But once the contact is lost, then you have to begin all over again.
Sir, may I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, so let's say that there is certain non-verbal sensation or something that arose, and right immediately a moment later, there will be a certain kind of identification, in the sense, in certain kind of recognition that this is so
Yeah,
and so.
yeah, yeah,
And in that moment, there is easily a certain projection saying that
yeah.
I know this, and I'm saying from my experience that this is anger or this is greediness,
Mm.
right? So,
Yeah.
and the very moment after there is fighting, okay, because this is greediness and I'm, it is not beneficial, I should not have it. So what seems to be happening is actually there is no interest in what is or what is arising anymore, but only a cacophony, a mess between sense of self and one of the traits of the sense of self.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
So
that is what usually happens. I mean, say a person trying to observe,
yeah,
or maybe first time he is trying that, then this is what usually happens, right? But nonetheless, he has to persist in his observation,
mm,
and each instant of observation has to be treated as the fresh attempt of observing. So, say you are, say, reaction arises, right? And you observe that reaction. And then during that observation, the thought comes and says, oh, I should not react like that, right? Now, I should not react like that should be treated instance where
fresh.
another fresh attempt to look at that has to be done. And when you do that attempt, then further thing comes up, then that also you observe the same way. If you connect all these attempts of observation, and through that connection, you create a view of chain, then that can create a
That's the
kind
thing.
of sensation of frustration, which says that, oh, you are not able to observe the way you would like to observe. So that will lead to a feeling of frustration. You may say that, oh, it is a hopeless activity. But that becomes hopeless only when you connect these various attempts and then see that thing as a continuity of the same thing. Then you may have that kind of feeling. But if each attempt is a fresh attempt, which means that without reference to what happened in the past, right? Then if it is a fresh attempt, then you are more likely to observe it without the observer. But if it is not a fresh attempt, then the past is actually continuing in the present moment. And that past nothing is but the observer.
Yeah.
And therefore, the same observer observing the next thing, it is going to observe in the same way. So, which means that nothing different is going to come out of that observation, but the same observation is being repeated. So, so what is important is to observe each event, each instance, each happening freshly, without reference to what happened in the past or past attempt.
Yeah. Yeah, moment to moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Sair.
Yeah.
Sir, I mean, I understand that there has been constant from childhood, we've been conditioned so that every situation comes to us, right? So every life situation which we get into, so the labeling has already been happened. So
Yes.
we take it as anger or anything. But
Yeah.
when I listen to you or when I listen to Krishnaji's videos or anything, but a fresh incident is being taken in. Like suppose you observe something that is not inside the library of your brain, and
Yeah.
any image that is not there. So then you feel like maybe I can understand this well.
Yeah.
But the chance is becoming less when it is already within me. Let it be anger or any incident that is already registered in my brain. So that is actually being difficult for me as well. To take it fresh, to uncondition it and look at it in a way that I won't label it again and again and see it afresh. And there is another thought which is coming, like what is that you want to achieve after the end of this observation? So a thought which comes into me, like, so a thinker is already coming in. Okay, now we are observing. What is the end result of that observation? So what is that he wanted to become?
Yes. See, whether the labeling happens or doesn't happen, but as long as whatever that is happening is being observed,
Yes, sir.
then you don't by itself is important. Right? So suppose a reaction has arisen and there is the response of the thinker is so quick that as the reaction is arising, that time itself it has labeled it. You can say that the anger or the fear is arising. So even before it has arisen completely, the thinker has already labeled it. So it doesn't matter. But the thinker labeling it is a fresh activity. So can that activity be observed as a fresh activity? So that means you are no longer referring to the reaction which is being labeled, but now you are just confronting the very activity of labeling. And when you are confronting the very activity of labeling, thought comes which says, oh, I should not label. Now, I should
Yes.
not label is the next activity. So can you again confront that activity without reference to the previous activity, which was that you labeled that sensation? Right? So when you say I should not label, then I should not label, can it be looked at afresh without reference to the past? Or when you say I should not label, and then again further thought comes, then that further thought, can it be observed afresh? Right? So which is that every event or every activity or every action or reaction, whatever that is being observed afresh and not connecting it to the previous thing and then creating a sense that I haven't been able to observe during all this time. Because I haven't been able to observe is a conclusion drawn by the observer based on the recording. But if there is no recording, then it cannot compare, then cannot connect like that. And so then observation, the fresh observation is possible and not the continuity of the observation. And if every observation is a fresh observation, then you can't even ask the question how to sustain that observation. Because the question of sustenance comes only when there is a continuity. Because whenever something continuous gets discontinued, then only the question arises as to how to keep it continuous. But something which is a fresh event happening, so observation happens, then there is the end, then again the next event, again the observation happens. And so it is an observation from moment to moment. But if you connect those moments, then it is no longer moment to moment.
That is the problem we're getting into.
Yes. Because the thinker, you see, the interesting thing is that through such kind of observation, when most of the reactions, either they become silent or they become dormant, and then there is a certain kind of space, a certain kind of emptiness, which is experienced by the observer, then the observer feels very uneasy with that kind of space because it feels lost. It just doesn't know what to do. So then it starts asking, oh, now what should I do? Or whether I have done this or whether I have done that or not done this or not done that. And then immediately get itself involved into some kind of work, some kind of activity, and then the whole thing is lost. So a person who may not be thinking of anything particular, so not observing, not paying attention, not doing anything, right? And then he may casually uh, uh, get involved into something and then get lost into that, right? I mean, the interesting example is, say you don't have much to do. Then you are thinking, oh, I have nothing to do, so what should I do, right? Then whether you should do this or whether you should do that, and then you suddenly remember, oh, let me check the WhatsApp messages. And then you may open the WhatsApp and reading those messages, posting this and that, and very quickly you get lost into that activity. And you may spend a very long time in that. And after that, you may come out of it, but then that sense of emptiness is lost. And so actually the interesting thing is that when you have nothing particular to do, right, then observing the state of the thinker, observing the state of mind, the sensation, the feeling, right? That feeling, is it a lost feeling or is it an uneasy feeling, a kind of uneasy state of mind or discomfortable state of mind? Because you see, the thinker always likes to keep itself occupied, because through the occupation only it is deriving its life and sustenance. And if it is no longer occupied, then it feels threatened, it feels lost. Therefore, it is always trying to look for some kind of occupation. Now, if a person is not observing, not interested in paying attention or observing, it is better that he keeps himself occupied. Otherwise, he is going to find life very difficult. Because that is what happens with a lot of people, that after retirement, they have certain, and if they have not developed any other interest in their life, then they are suddenly faced with a void. They just don't know what to do, how to occupy themselves, and whatever activity they may choose, they are not able to get involved in that for a long time. And so the question or this void remains, and then life becomes a burden for them. So for such people, it is better that they keep themselves occupied. But persons who are interested in this different kind of observation and paying attention and understanding themselves, understanding their own psychological nature, and then investigating something about life, whether there is anything more to life than whatever they are used to. For such people, right, this emptiness is very important. And in that emptiness, actually, the real nature of the observer will get revealed. Because whatever the observer feels while facing that emptiness shows the real nature of the observer. How it feels uneasy, how it feels uncomfortable, how it tries to fill the space or that emptiness with what kind of activity, how it justifies its involvement into those activities, and so on. It's very interesting to watch all that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, this question contains anger, fear, anxiety, etc. Shall I have to observe each one of them one by one, or all content can be emptied in a single observation?
No, my question is this: all this content become visible at the same time, or I have made a list of what is the content of my consciousness. Now, this list is made from the memory, from the knowledge, right? And then from that list, I want to observe, and then observing a content coming to its end, right? But can I decide like that and observe and then be free of that content? Probably not. Because whatever content becomes active and therefore becomes visible, that is the thing I have to watch. Because at that moment, that is the only active content, and only the active content can be watched. And so at that time, there is no question of what happens to the other content, because other content is only an idea as long as it is not active, right? I may say that yes, there is fear, there is jealousy, there is this, there is that, right? But it is not active at that moment. So if it is not active at that moment, it is as good as not being there. So whatever is active in the present moment, that is what fact is at the present moment. So that is what needs to be observed. Question of whether I should watch each content separately and then end it separately and then be free of the whole, or watching the whole content in an instant, right? So actually the very observing, so the active content, the content which is visible, content which is manifest, you have to begin there. So you observe that. While observing that, if you are also able to see the connections, and through that connections, you are able to reach the inactive content, right? Then you are able to watch that also. And following these connections, you may be able to see the whole network of all this content. And if you are able to see the whole network, then there is the immediate understanding of that whole network and a possibility of all of that coming to an end. But you cannot begin by saying that I have to watch the whole content in a glance and end it, because it doesn't happen that way. Whatever content is active, manifest, only that you can observe. And while observing that, if further things come up, then you can follow those links and observe whatever comes up next, and so on.
The last question from the chat.
Yeah.
If entire content of consciousness comes to end, is self-learning also required as entire consciousness was emptied?
Is the question, does the questioner wants to ask, when the entire consciousness is emptied, is the self-learning still required?
Yes,
Is that,
yes, sir.
is
Yes.
that the question? Yeah. So actually, there is nothing to learn. This is very interesting thing which Krishnaji says. First, he talks about learning. He talks about learning in terms of knowledge. Then he talks about learning without accumulating. And only such learning, which is without accumulation, can end the content of consciousness. And then he suddenly says that there is nothing to learn. So when the content of consciousness comes to an end, actually there is nothing to learn. And then what happens to learning? And we say that learning is not an activity. Learning is a state of mind. And a state of mind which is in a learning mode, right? So anything presented to it, there is immediate learning of whatever that is presented. So Krishnaji calls that as perception. So then learning is perception. And perception means the immediate understanding, the understanding in a flash. And then also that includes the corresponding action. So the perception operates at all levels. While intellectual understanding may operate only at the intellectual level, may not manifest into actual action. But the perception functions at all levels. And therefore, then learning is a completely different kind of thing. It's a state of mind. And anything that is presented to such state of mind is immediately perceived, is immediately understood, and then resulting into corresponding action. So that is the difference. That is what happens.
So there's one last question.
Yeah.
Sir, where does the interest to observe come from?
Well, now we have said in the morning that there is this tendency to learn. We call it in Sanskrit, it is called as jidnyasa. Or even in Hindi, Marathi, it is called jidnyasa. Jidnyasa means the intention to learn, intention to know. Now that is probably already there. It is there naturally. One only needs to awaken it. Awaken in the sense that maybe it has got covered up due to the activity of the thinker. The thinker has taken it over and learning in its own way about things, that is in terms of knowledge and so on. Right? But if we can remove that cover of the thinker, then it may be a natural state. And so it may be a state which is in constant movement, because learning is a movement. It is not a fixed kind of state where you say that I have learned. Because when you say I have learned, then it is finished, then there is no movement. But learning is an active present. It is not a dead past, as I have learned is a dead past. While active present is the this movement of learning. So it's a state of mind which is all the time moving and therefore learning. But also there is nothing to learn, which means there is actually nothing to accumulate. So there is no thing about which you are learning, but there is the immediate perception or immediate understanding of whatever that is happening. So it's a completely different state of mind, you can say. So I think we have exhausted all the questions probably.
Yes, sir.
Our time is also over. So may we stop at this point and then meet again tomorrow in the
Yes,
morning.
sir. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, then I am ending the meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a wonderful
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.